I'm sorry I'm not Julian Burnside. Really, I am. I'm deeply sorry I'm not Julian Burnside. Look, he's in and out of court all the time, that bloke. He'll end up in jail the way he's going. I was invited today to stand in for Julian in this regular event called Soapbox, which of course brings immediately to mind the image of those sort of ratbag orators who used to, possibly still do occasionally, congregate on the lawns outside the State Library just round the corner. I feel very much in their tradition, really, if you've seen any of them rabbiting on ceaselessly about God knows what. That's me. I was asked. It was pointed out to me that the soapbox is not an opportunity for a learned disquisition, nor for 15 minutes of stand-up comedy, but that it is an opportunity to put forward a coherent argument about a topic currently exercising my concerns. If you're looking for a coherent argument, however, I suggest you'd be drawing a very long bow here today. What you'll get from me are a series of impressions about something which really has been aggravating me, and I know a number of other people. But first of all, I'd just like to talk more generally about libraries and why I think I have, as it were, a kind of attachment to them, a stake. What gives me the sense that I have a dog in the fight that I'm about to pick. In the 10th century, Abdul Qasim Ismail, the Grand Vizier of Persia, was so attached to his collection of 117,000 volumes that he couldn't bear to be apart from them when he was travelling around the country on his official duties. So he took them with him, all 117,000 volumes, carried by a caravan of 400 camels who were trained to walk in alphabetical order. This was, of course, before the Dewey system. Getting camels to walk in a Dewey configuration is much more difficult, although I imagine that the alphabet problem was fairly difficult for them. And of course, however ingenious this solution was, it's really no way to run a library. So the static library was invented and the camels were retrained as financial advisors. I bring this up as an item of library trivia, if you like. I didn't get this from the site called Library Porn. I don't know if any of you who've visited Library Porn, but it's in fact a website of the most gorgeous libraries in the world, spread out before you for your delectation, and I recommend it to you. I got that from Alberto Manguel, whose history of reading has recently been followed up by his book on libraries. And for me, and I guess for most of you, libraries have been central to my experience as a reader. They've also become crucial to me in my ongoing work as a writer. I think I could trace my life through libraries, through the libraries that I've used. They constitute a kind of series of milestones reaching back through the decades to the moment when I first discovered that there was in fact a treasure house hidden in plain sight behind a patch of lawn next to the Hamilton Town Hall. That was an eye-opener for me. We had very few books at home. I'm not going to get my violin out on this, but there were relatively few books, and I'm pretty convinced that the nuns who ran things at St Mary's Primary School were not entirely in favour of books, at least to the extent that there wasn't a school library. So for a 7-year-old with a perverse attraction to information and stories, and in fact the entire outside universe, and the library became a kind of portal through which I could travel and become, in effect, anything I wanted. From the Hamilton Library, I advanced to the adolescent fiction shelves, or the hornblower section, you might call it, of the Chadstone Library, which is in those days was a brick annex in the park behind the Ampol service station on Chatty Road. I imagine it's probably now a fakak outlet or a shoe shop. But anyway, at that time it was just really a downhill ride to the Oakley Library, where they had the really hardcore stuff, history, politics, philosophy. And by that stage I'd got to the point where, while I was still at school, I'd catch the train into the Baillieu Library at Melbourne University, which at that stage in the late 60s seemed to me to sort of in many ways exemplify a lot of things that universities were. The whole joint, the university was sort of humming and throbbing, and even though it was silent, it seemed to me that an essential part of the whole sort of structure of that enterprise was the library. And thence I moved on to various university libraries, and even to the Holy of Holies, the National Library in Canberra, where for very briefly I had my own carrel, and I found that a very convenient place to nap. When my first novel, Stiff, was published, one of the first invitations I received to give an author talk came from the Mount Waverley Library. It was 1984. Jeff Kennett was aligned rampant, and naturally I was worried about going to the eastern suburbs after dark. God knows, could have been waylaid by a representative of LJ Hooker Real Estate, or sneered at by a Haileybury boy. Almost anything could have happened. But I summoned up my courage, and once I was out there and in the library, I knew I was safe. And so I found myself saying something which I came to, which I discovered sort of resonated somewhat, and which I've since talked about at literally dozens of municipal libraries all over the country. And that is, that to remind the library staff and the readers that they should never forget what an invaluable place local libraries have in sustaining a sense of shared civic values, the kinds of values that are essential to a free people in a democratic society. And I certainly think that was the animating spirit behind their establishment. And it's for precisely these reasons, I thought at the time, that libraries would find themselves challenged and attacked by those whose values lay elsewhere. At that time, I thought that the danger to libraries would come from threats to public institutions posed by the economic rationalist doctrines of user pays. The all-pervasive forces of privatisation would let their eye alight on libraries and see an opportunity and move to break them up into their constituent parts under the rubric of user pays and milk them for their revenue streams. My fears, it turns out, were misdirected. It's not the enemies of libraries who represent the greatest threat to them at the moment, but paradoxically, I think they're custodians that do so. But more of that later. Having been condemned to life as a writer, I began to use libraries as a place to work. The house was full of distractions, so going to the library both kept me away from the temptation of doing the dishes, and it felt like I was going to work, that I had a proper job. It was also very useful to find myself within arm's reach of both general reference works and specific publications pertinent to the writing projects on which I was working. And then, of course, there was the added incentive of all that purposeful distraction, all of those books. I finally resolved that by working at the Brownless Biomedical Library at Melbourne University, where, unless I was interested in the International Journal of Molecular Biology, 1928 to 1932, there was bugger all browsing to be done on the shelves. But what libraries gave me above all, I think, was a sense of inspiration. That libraries seemed somehow to have retained and distilled the concentrated cerebral energy of all those who'd ever worked there in a kind of force field into which I could immerse myself. And that sense began to rub off, and it rubbed off, in fact, into the plot of my second book. I'm not going to bore you by reading a big slab of it, but there's a bit that I remembered quite recently, and I thought it might be worth sharing with you, since it was both about and produced in an institution not too far from here. This is the voice of my protagonist, Murray Whelan. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and if you want to really live dangerously, the State Library is a good place to start. Even on a quiet Saturday afternoon, its obliging staff can take your vaguest apprehensions and turn them into a swarm of disturbing possibilities. The domed reading room was hushed and serene, bathed in the cool submarine light that filtered down from its huge cavernous hemisphere high above. The long tables radiating from its centre were like the spokes of a wheel, an imperceptibly moving cog in wisdom's silent mill. But of course the State Library ain't what it used to be, even back then. I couldn't write that passage now, not even setting it on a quiet Saturday. I'd have to include references to the throngs of people apparently unacquainted with the concept of library etiquette, to the free internet with its queues of backpackers waiting to save $2 that they would otherwise spend in an internet cafe down the road so they can check their email or update their Facebook pages. I'd have to include phone users making arrangements for the evening, school kids socialising, and tour parties of seniors from Warrnambool come to see the refurbished domed reading room. Well, at least the tour parties of seniors know better than to yodel in the Latrobe, which cannot be expected of the educational tours for preschoolers. I don't know if you've ever been there when Bubs comes through, presumably looking for the squeak and wipe section. But certainly the notion that one can immerse oneself in a kind of subterranean bath of meditative knowledge is long gone. For a while I thought maybe it's just me, that I was suffering from premature grumpy old man syndrome. That's certainly the response I got when I brought the matter up with several of the senior library staff. But then, a couple of months ago, an article appeared in The Age written by Leslie Canold, which made me realise that I was not alone in this sense that there was more going on in the library than should be going on, and a lot of it was getting on my nerves, let's say. Leslie's article was soon followed by one by Ian McShane, which appeared on the in the online magazine Inside Story. It's a great online magazine, and I keep saying online, so you do understand that I'm not entirely coming from a Luddite position on this. Leslie's article prompted more than 50 letters to The Age, so I knew I wasn't alone. Even if the state librarian did, I think, take a somewhat high-handed tone in a response to Leslie's article. We've got a lot of users, she seemed to be saying, like it or lump it. Now, in the Leslie Canold article, if I read her right, she saw this to some extent as a behavioural and generational problem, almost one of manners. That young people don't know better and need instruction. Well, I'm a strong believer in the view that young people don't know better and they need instruction just generally, let alone in the library. But I could see where she was coming from. And this was reinforced by one of the responses to her article, coming from what I could only presume to be the self-declared voice of idiotic entitlement. I quote, Don't discourage youth using the library in whatever chaotic way we like. Either embrace our antics or do your work on a Sunday morning. Amy Jane Plant, Canterbury. Well, that's very discourteous of you, I thought. Amy Jane Plant, fuck you. Ian McShane saw this more as a structural problem, that librarians had become trapped in their own rhetoric, that notions of accessibility had so diluted their core tasks as to place them in an impossible situation. And this brings me back to my earlier point about guarding the library from its own guardians. It seems to me at the moment that the profession of librarianship is at something of a difficult crossroads. It's one that librarianship shares with I think all of us who are involved in the business of making and storing and reading books, that in this post-Gutenbergian universe of Kindles and e-publishing and all kinds of unknowable futures, the library, I think, has backed itself into a corner. A small example of that is provided by the question of providing internet access and online catalogues and online materials. I mean, the whole point about these is that they can be accessed by anyone from anywhere. So why do you have to have the terminal in the library? You might as well put it in the community health centre, probably to more effect, because really the only justification for it is to provide online access to people who don't have it at home. That is to say, people who need to go to some kind of common point. But if you've gone there to look up something that's online anyway, that really could be anywhere. My main interest in all of this, I think, is definitely the state library. That I think that there are pressures on municipal libraries and university libraries that are really quite different in some key ways from those on the state library. As the state library is not just a big municipal library or a big university library. It is at its core essentially and fundamentally a collection of books, of drawings, sketches, artworks, artefacts and so on, which have been aggregated over a long period, more than a century, with a kind of conscious purpose, with a conscious focus behind it. So while the building may be very nice and may cost a lot of money, and there may be any number of justifications for letting people through the door to see where the public money is being spent, it's fundamentally just a box for the collection. And what I have a sense of going on at the moment is that the collection has been lost sight of. That one of the reasons I say that is that that despite the incredible growth of numbers of people using the library, if you call books down from the stacks, they appear at certain pickup points. My observation is that fewer and fewer of those materials are appearing at those pickup points, and in fact there used to be 2 pickup points, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's only 1 now. So despite the fact that there are more people coming through the door, there's no real, to me, visible evidence that they're coming through to use the collection, to access the collection. They're coming in for other reasons. Now, those reasons can't possibly now include quiet and contemplative study. So if they're not coming to access the collection or to work, as it were, on bookish and writing things, what then is the justification for increasing the numbers? So I'm just going to throw some ideas out here. Some of them were canvassed in letters arising from the Canold article, and one of them explicitly elaborated by Ian McShane in his piece, and some of them are my own. They don't in themselves constitute any kind of cogent argument. They are just matters that, to me, are bouncing around, arising from this. One of them is that because librarians are answerable for their funding to governments that adhere to a management doctrine that places no value on what librarians do, they're actually in a cleft stick. Because what librarians do cannot effectively be weighed, counted, quantified, enumerated, devolved, maximised, minimised, or given a one-line mission statement, it can't be accommodated either within the ideology or the bookkeeping methods of the bodies to which libraries must go for their funding. Now, in a small way, Ian McShane has found, if you like, a kind of escape clause in this. What he has suggested, and I'll read from his article here. The State Library of Victoria domed reading room has been graced by some of Australia's finest writers and deserted by them, according to Canold. Finding quiet or silent spaces is increasingly difficult in urban situations. In the 1980s, the educator Ivan Illich proposed that silence be thought of as a commons, a resource that everyone shares and everyone has a responsibility to nurture. The library's magnificent Swanston Street building is listed on the Victorian Heritage Register. The entry describes in detail the building's evolution and architectural features, culminating in the construction of the reading room in 1913, rightly observing that the library is both an essential part of Melbourne culture and a site of national significance. But a quiet ambience is also part of the institutional heritage of major libraries, and just as palpable as the building fabric. Perhaps it's time to revise the building's heritage listing to include its atmosphere and give the silence of the reading room statutory protection. I love that idea. And I want to put it out there as much as I can. More random thoughts. I think most of us who have used the library have observed that the pressure on it has increased as the number of international students registered at dodgy colleges within a stone's throw of this place are building up. Many of these places actually advertise the State Library as though it is a campus facility, when in fact we know that the campus consists entirely of a letterhead and a room on the 8th floor of a building in La Trobe Street. The international students have nowhere else to go for their study halls. And in fact, what's happening here is that the cost of these students is being passed on to the State Library and impacting adversely on its users, just in terms of the increased numbers of users. The educational colleges should pay for their students to use the place. I'm not sure how they do this and how you'd get the money out of them at the rate that they're going broke, but at the very minimum they should chip in for some very big signs reading "shut up" in the home language of their international students. Thirdly, the current State Library Board, I think, is ill-equipped to deal with many of the issues confronting the library. It has 11 members. It's chaired by John Cain, who I think nobody would doubt is a strong supporter of literature in Victoria. But of its 11 members, there is an accountant, a local government bureaucrat, a specialist in governance, statistics and econometrics, a retired politician, other than John Cain, a professional regulator, a PR consultant and the IT manager for a bank. There is only one writer, admittedly a person of considerable distinction as a writer, scholar and researcher, but only one in that mix. Now, that seems to me is not a healthy mix to imaginatively guide a major institution like the library into the future. Who speaks for the collection on that list? Who speaks for scholarship? Who brings the money, for God's sake? I mean, these kinds of institutions anywhere else in the country, anywhere else in the world, you have people lining up to add a bit of gloss to their ill-gotten gains by making donations. The library is going cap in hand to government when there are undoubtedly, I believe, people who would be prepared to pay for the prestige of sitting on the board, or at least go and twist their rich friends' arms. So, I think some consideration should be given. Well, how does it work? You know, would the board be prepared to examine itself? No, the government gets exactly the kinds of people that it can talk to because they talk the same sort of language. But I think, unfortunately, the library is ill-served by that preponderance of generalist managerialists on the board. These are all big questions. I don't have a claim to any answers, and I don't have any more time. So what I'm doing in the meantime, just as a small personal gesture, is that I'm having these little cards made up, which can be slipped to noisy other library users, very quietly and discreetly so as not to disturb anyone, and they will read simply, "Shut the fuck up or I'll stab you through the eye with this pencil." I'm taking orders, and anyone who'd like them, their name added to the list for the cards, see me later. Thank you.